My name's Aaron. I'm 29 and I live alone in a small rental house just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. I work at a hardware store off 4th Street, mostly stocking, mixing paint, answering the same three questions about snow shovels every winter. My sister lives down in Phoenix, about a 2-hour drive south, and she checks in on me more than I check in on her. I don't mind the solitude up here. I've always told people I like the quiet. Late January is when Flagstaff gets serious about winter. Not the pretty postcard snow, but the heavy, insulating kind that erases sound and makes everything feel padded and distant. My routines are boring but practical. Keep the pipes dripping on really cold nights, shovel early before the snow compacts, park facing downhill in case the driveway turns to ice. That night, I remember thinking the storm forecast sounded exaggerated. It usually does. By 9:30 p.m., the snow was already coming down thick and steady. Not blowing, just falling straight, quietly, like gravity had decided to work overtime. I'd eaten a late dinner, watched half of something on Netflix without paying attention, and texted my sister a picture of the snow piling up against the porch rail. She sent back a thumbs up and told me not to lose power again. That's when the lights flickered, just once at first. A soft blink that reset the microwave clock and made the room feel suddenly smaller. I stood there, remote in hand, listening. Normally you can hear I-40 in the distance, or at least the wind pushing through the trees. That night there was nothing. The snow had swallowed everything. I told myself it was normal. Winter storms do that. I lit the small lamp by the couch instead of using the overhead lights, mostly to save power, partly because the softer glow felt better. I remember noticing how loud my own breathing sounded. Around 10, the power flickered again, longer this time, and didn't fully come back. The heater shut off. The house settled with a series of small pops and ticks, like it was adjusting to a new shape. I pulled on a hoodie and thicker socks, irritated more than afraid. That's when I saw movement outside the front window. Not fast, just a shape passing through the snow, close enough that the porch light caught it. I assumed it was a neighbor at first, even though the nearest house is a good 100 yards away and mostly empty in winter. I stepped closer to the window, careful not to silhouette myself. A man stood at the end of my porch. He wasn't bundled the way people usually are up here. No bulky coat, no scarf wrapped halfway over his face. Just a dark jacket, zipped neatly, hands at his sides. Snow gathered on his shoulders and hair, but he didn't seem bothered by it. And Jackie looked up at the house, directly at the window, and smiled. I froze. That smile wasn't wide or exaggerated. It was polite, patient. He raised a hand and gave a small knock on the door, 3 taps, controlled, like he knew exactly how loud they'd sound inside. I didn't move. My first thought wasn't fear, it was guilt. The instinctive, awful kind. Someone stranded in a storm, someone who might need help. That's how it starts in your head before the unease catches up. "Hello?" he called. His voice carried easily through the door, calm and conversational. "I know you're home." That's when my stomach dropped. I hadn't turned on the porch light. My car was in the garage. The house should have looked dark and empty. I backed away from the window and locked the deadbolt, even though I was pretty sure it already was. My hands shook more than I expected. I grabbed my phone and tried calling my sister. No signal. I tried 911. The call didn't go through, just a long, empty tone before disconnecting. Another knock, same rhythm. "I don't want to bother you," the man said pleasantly. "I just need to come in for a minute. The roads are bad." I didn't answer. I stood in the hallway, lights off, listening to the blood rush in my ears. Part of me waited for anger, pounding fists, raised voice. It never came. Instead, he sighed softly, like someone inconvenienced. "That's all right," he said. "I can wait." Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time got slippery. The cold crept in as the house lost heat, and I realized my fingers were numb around the phone. I crouched behind the kitchen counter, heart hammering, every sense tuned toward the front door. Eventually, the porch light clicked off. I hadn't touched the switch. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. The next thing I knew, gray morning light filled the house and the heater hummed back to life. Power restored. Silence returned to its normal shape. I stood at the front window for a long time before opening the door. The snow was untouched, except for a single set of footprints leading up to the porch. They stopped right in front of the door. They didn't lead away. They were facing the house, toes pointed inward, as if whoever made them had stood there for a long time, watching. I never thought a snowstorm could feel like a living thing, but that night, it did. I was 28, living alone in a small rented cabin on the outskirts of Montpelier, Vermont. It was mid-February, the kind of bitter cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I'd grown up in the Midwest, so snow wasn't foreign to me, but the isolation here was different. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the nearest town was 20 minutes by car, a distance that seemed meaningless until the roads disappeared under a thick, unbroken blanket of white. I worked remotely, so I spent most days alone, but normally the quiet was comforting. That night, it wasn't. It started like any other snowstorm. I'd spent the afternoon running errands, stocking up on groceries, and by 5 p.m., the first flakes had begun to drift lazily down. I made myself a simple dinner, a grilled cheese sandwich and some soup, and settled in with a book by the fireplace. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the window panes. At first, it was just a nuisance, a reminder that winter was relentless in Vermont. But as the night deepened, the wind sounded almost deliberate, as if it had its own intent. I noticed the first odd thing around 8 p.m. The sound of the snow shifting outside was different, heavier, more rhythmic than it should be. I live on a slight incline, so the snow tends to drift unevenly, but this was more like footsteps, soft and deliberate, brushing against the house. I paused my reading, listening, telling myself it was probably an animal or the wind playing tricks on the roof. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By 10 p.m., the storm was in full swing. I'd already lost cell service a couple of hours earlier, and the cabin's power flickered on and off. I lit some candles and moved closer to the fireplace. That's when I started hearing it more clearly. A faint scraping coming from the back of the house. The cabin has a small storage shed attached to the back, mostly empty except for a few snow shovels and old furniture. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind pushing against the door, but my stomach tightened, a cold knot forming. Something didn't feel right. I told myself to check it and grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the thick darkness outside the small window at the back of the cabin. Nothing. Just snow. Endless snow, swirling so thickly it looked like the world had disappeared. I opened the door carefully, the wind immediately hitting me like a wall. I shined the flashlight toward the shed. Nothing moved. My heart was pounding, my breath coming out in sharp, visible puffs. I closed the door, trying to calm myself, telling myself I was imagining it. Around midnight, the unease became impossible to ignore. The scraping noise returned, louder, coming from the roof this time. It moved, slow, deliberate, like someone walking just above me. I froze, listening, barely daring to breathe. The snowstorm had grown into a whiteout outside, the wind howling like it was screaming. I felt trapped in a small, fragile cocoon of wood and glass, powerless against whatever was out there. Then I heard it, a knock. Not the gentle tap of someone politely at a door, but a sharp, deliberate knock against the window next to my bed. I almost fell over in panic. My first thought was that someone had come here in the storm, but the nearest road was impassable. The knocking came again, slower this time, almost as if it was testing me, waiting for a reaction. My flashlight was still in my hand and I wanted to shine it at the window, but my body refused to move. My rational mind screamed that it had to be something simple, a branch blown by the wind, but every instinct in my body was screaming otherwise. I backed away, fumbling for my phone, but the battery had died hours ago. I had no way to call for help, no one to check in with. The storm had cut me off completely. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, listening as the knocking stopped. The wind outside softened for a moment, almost cautiously, and I allowed myself a shaky breath. Maybe it was over, I thought. Maybe it had been nothing. Then I heard it from the back door. Heavy breathing. Slow, measured. I grabbed a kitchen knife, small, inadequate, but it made me feel slightly less helpless, and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear against the cold wood. Nothing. The sound had stopped. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. I whispered to myself, trying to be brave, "It's just the wind. It's just the wind." The storm had a way of bending perception. Shadows in the candlelight stretched across the walls like they were alive. I could hear the snow pressing against the windows, creating a dull, muffled thumping. Then, from the kitchen, I heard it. A tap, soft but insistent, on the counter. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned toward the sound. Empty. The sound came again, and my mind raced, trying to come up with explanations. Roof settling, the wind, a branch. But I couldn't ignore the logic creeping in. Nothing should be moving inside this cabin. I live alone. I spent the next hour pacing, flashlight in hand, listening. Every creak, every whisper of wind felt amplified, turned into a threat. At some point, I must have dozed off sitting on the floor because I woke to an almost suffocating silence. The storm had quieted, almost suspiciously. My relief was instant but uneasy. Something about the sudden calm felt wrong. I checked every door and window, locked, secured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the cabin with me. By morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving the world outside an endless white desert. I ventured outside, heart hammering, to find deep tracks in the snow around the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were large, heavy, and they ended abruptly at the edge of the forest. I followed them for a bit, my stomach in knots, but they disappeared under a thin layer of fresh snow. Even now, years later, I can't explain it. I never saw anyone, never found a clue, nothing stolen, nothing damaged. But the sense of being watched, of something deliberately probing the thin barrier between my small, fragile cabin and the outside world, it never left me. Every snowstorm since, I double-checked my locks, flashlights ready, feeling that same tight knot of dread in my chest. I can't tell if it was a person, an animal, or something else entirely, but I know that storm, that night, had eyes on me, and for a long, unnerving moment, I felt like the snow itself was alive. I moved back into my parents' farmhouse in western Pennsylvania because it was the only place that made sense after the divorce. There was nothing sentimental about it, no warm, cinematic returning home. It was just practical, no rent, heat that mostly worked, a kitchen with cabinets that still closed if you nudged them hard enough, a second-floor bedroom where I could shut the door and pretend I had control over at least one small part of my life. I'm 34. I've heard enough Pennsylvania winters to know the difference between wind and imagination. I've lived in old houses before. I know what settling wood sounds like. I know pipes knock. I know floorboards complain. This house has always creaked like it's remembering something. That night, the storm rolled in heavy, turning everything beyond the windows into a wall of white. By 11, the wind was pressing hard against the siding. Snow hit the glass in steady bursts, illuminated by the orange glow of the distant streetlight. It made the outside world look like it was dissolving into static. I was upstairs in what used to be my childhood room. Bed, desk, one lamp in the corner, and a dresser that had belonged to my mother when she was a girl. I sat cross-legged on the bed, a book open in my lap, reading the same paragraph over and over without absorbing a word. The power dipped, just a flicker. The lamp dimmed briefly, then steadied. I didn't move. Storms did that. The wiring in this place was older than I was. A minute later, the lamp flickered again. This time, it wasn't the house. It wasn't the power. It felt like hesitation. Like the bulb itself was unsure whether it wanted to stay on. The light stuttered, almost died, then returned. A cold ripple moved across my skin. "Relax," I muttered to myself. I lowered my eyes back to the page. That's when I heard the click. Soft, sharp, close. The sound came from the hallway door, the one separating my room from the rest of the upstairs. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched it since locking it earlier that night. Click, like the latch being tested. I froze, listening. The storm roared outside. The furnace hummed somewhere below. Nothing else moved. I stood and walked to the door, placing my hand on the knob. The metal felt colder than it should have. I didn't turn it. I just checked the lock. Still locked. I stayed there for a long moment, ear near the wood. Silence. "It's the wind," I said out loud. But the wind doesn't test door handles. I went back to the bed, but I didn't sit right away. My eyes stayed on the door. The lamp flickered again. I looked at the wall beside the dresser and noticed something I hadn't before. The lamp's shadow looked off. Thinner. Slightly shifted, as if the light source had moved a few inches to the side. But the lamp hadn't moved. I leaned forward. The shadow slid a fraction to the right. Not much. Just enough. Like something had stepped between the light and the wall for half a second. I blinked, and it returned to normal. My throat tightened. I told myself I was tired. Alone too long. My brain was trying to create patterns. I stood and crossed to the dresser, opening the top drawer for no reason other than to do something normal. Socks, old receipts, nothing disturbed. When I closed the drawer, I noticed the photo frame. It held a picture of my parents and me from some 4th of July years ago. It had been crooked since I moved back in, slightly angled just enough to be irritating. Now it was perfectly straight, centered with unnatural precision. I stared at it. I hadn't fixed it. I would have remembered. Slowly, deliberately, I tilted it back to its old crooked position. I stepped away. When I looked again, it was straight. My stomach dropped. I didn't touch it this time. I didn't want to turn this into a game. Around midnight, the door clicked again. Not opening, not closing, just that small metallic shift. This time I didn't move toward it. I stood in the middle of the room and listened. The house groaned softly, like it was breathing. The lamp dimmed once more, and the shadows stretched along the wall. They lingered longer than they should have. At some point, I lay back down, keeping my eyes on the corner of the room. That's when I saw it. The lamp's shadow was there. But behind it, faint and thinner, was another outline. Slightly taller, slightly warped. It didn't match anything in the room. I sat up sharply. The second shadow didn't disappear. It remained layered behind the first, like something standing just out of sight. I moved my head left. The lamp's shadow shifted accordingly. The second one lagged, as if it was responding to something else entirely. I didn't leave the room. I couldn't. The hallway felt wrong, like stepping into it would acknowledge something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, the room felt colder. The lamp was on. I was certain I had turned it off. The switch was flipped upward. I hadn't done that. I slowly turned my head toward the dresser. The photo frame was no longer straight. It was turned completely around, facing the wall. Not tilted, not nudged, lifted, rotated, placed back down. There were no scratches on the dresser surface. No sign it had slid. I didn't approach it. I didn't need to. I understood what it meant. Something had touched it. Something careful. I shut the lamp off again and lay back in the darkness. The air felt different. Not colder from winter, but occupied. The house wasn't creaking anymore. It was listening. Dawn eventually began to seep through the blinds, washing the room in gray light. I forced myself to look at the dresser. The frame was back to its original crooked angle, exactly how it had been when I first moved in. Like nothing had happened, except for the shadow on the wall behind it. A thin, dark line extended from the corner of the frame to the far corner of the room, slightly curved, like a drawn path. And that path ended exactly where the second shadow had stood the night before. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Because in the daylight, with the storm finally fading, I understood something I hadn't let myself accept before. It wasn't the wiring. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate, measured, aware. Something in that room had been watching me the way a person watches another person, quietly, patiently, without announcing itself. It hadn't tried to scare me. It hadn't needed to. It was just waiting. And I knew, with a certainty that made my skin crawl, it wasn't finished yet.